We'll get this show on the road. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Welcome to our third Thursday lecture. My name is Ed Branley. I go by NOLA History Guy online on all the social medias and that kind of stuff. And it's great to see everybody here. Was great for the. We had a great turnout in January for Derby's talk on affairs of honor and all the dueling stuff. And when we were planning this, and Derby said he was going to do a thing on dueling, my first thought was, well, I'll just follow that by talking about the Allard Plantation, because that's where dueling oak was, right? And so it just was one of many places. Matter of fact, we're just having a conversation. I'm picking his brain on a story idea I have that looks like it'll be the halfway house, but that's fine by me for a duel. But you kind of get the idea with that. So I figured that talking about the Allard Plantation would be a good follow-up to all of, I don't have any good dueling stories. Derby had them all last month, but we're going to talk a little bit about the Allard Plantation in Bayou St. John tonight. So thank everybody for coming. That's me, of course. It's NOLA History Guy, at NOLA History Guy on Instagram and Blue Sky. The page is NOLA History Guy. And then, of course, the website is nolahistoryguy.com. If you ever need to email me, that's the best place to get a hold of me and all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about the Allard Plantation tonight. We're going to talk about why are we talking about the Allard Plantation in the first place and go through some of that. We're going to talk about the bayou itself and the indigenous that were there before the Europeans got there, and then the early Europeans. That turns into the Spanish land grants of basically of the 1770s, where that land is mostly all then divided up into plantation land and land blocks. What did they grow? Well, they started with indigo, but of course the big thing that was grown on those plantations at the time was sugarcane. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the plantation house for the Allard Plantation, which is an interesting story we'll get into. Then we'll talk about the 3 oaks of City Park now, but that were on the property. And that's, of course, Suicide, Dueling, and Singing Oak. And we'll look at the stories of those. We'll talk about the tomb by Dueling Oak, which I don't know if you guys knew about that or are familiar with it, but there was a tomb right under the oak. If you were gonna wanted a nice, quiet, permanent resting place, you can't ask for a better place than right under those big 300, 400-year-old oak trees. We'll talk about that. And then we'll wrap it by talking about the sale of the plantation to John McDonough. The Allards lose the plantation, and then the nascent city park that grows out from that. So the first thing up is, why talk about the Allard Plantation in the first place? And I hate, it's like, I used to teach computer stuff, and they always tell you, it's like, Microsoft always makes computer instructors read the slides word for word. So any other company that you work for, they would say, never read the slides. You sound like a Microsoft guy. Anyway, but this one, I'm going to read the text is the text of the marker for the Allard Plantation. Plantation of Louis Allard was purchased by his grandfather, Don Santiago Lorreins, in 1770s from the estate of Francisco Hery, called Duplanty, builder of the first Cabildo building in New Orleans in 1769. That's not the one that's there now. The one that's there now dates to 1795 because of the fires in 1788 and 1794. But remember, the Cabildo is the town council. I don't know if you knew that, but pause for a minute on that one, since I am a tour guide for the Friends of the Cabildo and a docent for the museum. Cabildo is the Spanish name for the city council in the various cities and towns all throughout New Spain: Havana, had a cabildo. Mexico City had a cabildo. Lima, Peru had a cabildo. Naturally, when New Orleans became a Spanish holding in officially 1762, 1768 with O'Reilly, actually things started happening here in terms of Spanish government. We had a cabildo. The building where the cabildo met was always referred to as the Casa Capitular. Thing was, Mexico City, no problem. Havana, no problem. New Orleans, a little bit different. We didn't speak Spanish here. They did down, you had people down at the port, right? But, we weren't a Spanish-speaking colony. So you get the French, who are pretty much like, I'm not saying Casa Capitular, right? Basically it's not French. So what happens is the name of the town council becomes the name of the building. Hey, Pierre, where are you going? I have business with the cabildo, meaning he's going to the town council. Well, I have business with the cabildo becomes I'm going to the cabildo. So guess where I spent my day this morning, of course, at the cabildo, leading a high school tour. But anyway, kind of get the idea there. Okay, acquired from Allard in 1845 by John McDonough. We'll tell that story. Given to New Orleans in 1850. The one thing about this is there's a bit of a conflict. I'll explain it in a minute, but the Lorreins, it's not clear because of the names. Was it it's his grandfather-in-law, or is it his father-in-law? But that neither here nor there when you get down to it. The plantation itself, of course, was all up a good bit of Bayou St. John. So we're talking basically if Singing Oak and Suicide Oak are up by Big Lake, the plantation started down at the intersection, what is now Wisner, City Park Avenue, and Carrollton. So the plantation kind of goes down to that point, which is kind of that where Bayou Metairie would connect to Bayou St. John, and then up well past Big Lake, past the Art Museum, Big Lake, going up probably, I'd have to look. I'd have to measure it, but a little bit past where I-610 is now. So kind of get the idea there. The plantation dates back to the Spanish colonial period. It's a Spanish land grant, which, like I said, the Spanish didn't settle into government until 1768. So that's why, just for those things, we usually say 1770s and go from there. And then it, of course, eventually becomes our largest public park. Indigenous on the bayou. The story begins with the native tribes of the area because it goes back all the way to the Lemoyne brothers, Jean-Baptiste and Pierre. So we come back, let's take a step back a little bit to the 1690s. So you got 1692, Robert Cavalier Sieur de la Salle comes down the river, gets to the mouth of the river, claims everything. He comes back with ships in 1694 to colonize his find, cash in, the whole bit. Except La Salle makes an incredible navigational error. He can't find the mouth of the river. Remember, he came down from Montreal through the Great Lakes, over time, of course, not on one trip. But he came down the river. So when he came back from France. So he comes in the Gulf. But the problem with the Mississippi River is what's called a bird's foot delta. It's just got the three passes. It's not like in a magnificent bay with a natural harbor that you could spot. Well, that bay, we find the river. You don't find anything when you try to find Southwest Pass, right? There's nothing there. So LaSalle ended up in 1694, LaSalle overshoots everything. He ends up in Matagorda Bay down by Corpus. He suggests to 5 shiploads of colonists that they walk back to the Mississippi River. They buried him there in Matagorda Bay, the guy was brilliant. You know, it's like, it sounds like it truly was an unfitting end for a guy who really has, that's why you've got LaSalle University. We've got Derby's alma mater up on St. Charles Avenue. You kind of get the idea. There's a lot of things named for Robert, but yeah, his end wasn't that great. The papers, documents, everything else came back because basically those people, they just got back on the ships and went back to France. The Lemoyne brothers took all of that and ran with it in 1698. Pierre, 20 years older than Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste was younger. He didn't have a care in the world. He was one of those guys that had a knack for languages. He was kind of a carousing, gregarious kind of guy. They get to Mobile. They get to Old Biloxi, which is now Ocean Springs. Jean-Baptiste, Sieur de Bienville, does the one thing that LaSalle did not do. He stopped and asked for directions. And he knew enough, you know, he had a thing with languages. He knew enough to, you know, to get a conversation going with the indigenous. And they told him, no, man, don't worry about the mouth of the river. So he's in Ocean, what is, you know, we say Old Biloxi now, original Biloxi. He's over there. They say, leave the ship here, build some flat-bottom canoes, which are pirogues. Thank you. Anyway, yeah, build some flat-bottom canoes. He makes his way into Lake Borgne, makes his way into Lake Pontchartrain, and they've told him what to look for. They told him to look for Bayou St. John. Why? Because there's going to be indigenous tribes. There's going to be indigenous outposts all the way there. You see a little smoke from a campfire. You know you're in the right place. That whole thing. So the French come to New Orleans initially, literally down the bayou. They come into Lake Pontchartrain, come down the bayou. He gets to basically the old portage there, just basically at the tip of what becomes the Allard Plantation. They have to hoof it from there. That's the Great Portage, right? Because you've got about 2.5 miles from, basically you got 2.5 miles on foot from Parkway Bakery back down to Jackson Square is what it boils down to. She had to schlep the canoes back down to the river at that point. Along the way, they're spotting things. They're looking, hey, you know, it's nice land, you know, that kind of thing. You get some of these guys, they're kind of making notes on, I can come back, do things here, that sort of stuff. One of the people that actually had the good sense to write down what he was doing was Antoine-Simon Lepage Dupratz. And he writes his History of Louisiana in 1754. Antoine was one of the original guys that's with Bienville in 1718, comes back 1721. They're setting up camp basically right down there in what of course the indigenous referred to as Bulbancha, the place of many tongues, the trading post the outpost that is now the French market basically. But Antoine's one of these guys, he kind of wants to be on his own, he wants to write, he wants to hang out. He goes back up the bayou. So he goes up the bayou into that area that later becomes the Allard Plantation. He lives for 2 years along Bayou St. John. He buys a Chitimacha girl from the girl's father as a cook and to teach him the lingua franca of the area, that kind of thing. And basically she teaches him what he needs to know. Eventually he goes off and moves up the river to the areas held by the Natchez tribe. He takes the Chitimacha girl with him. The father basically says, you are now, you are her, she is your ward. You are now, she's your problem, basically. Father, just kind of going from there with that. This is an illustration from Dupratz's book, History of Louisiana, which is written in French. God help me, because I took German at Brother Martin, but what do I know? But there is a couple, if you look in the Gutenberg Project, there's if anybody needs it in English, I can point you to the link and everything. This is a picture that it's probably the Natchez based on the timing in the documentation. It says, Marche du Calumet des Pais, March of the Peace Pipe. And so it was a ceremony to, whenever you're working something out, the whole thing with the peace pipe is real. That it's all, it's real, it's accurate, everything else. So they would parade up, and in this case, they were negotiating with the French outpost up in that area and trying to work it out, which, spoiler alert, it didn't work out. It was kind of rough. Another story comes from Charles de Gaillard, and you probably heard of Gaillard. He's got this guy has a street named after him, so he's got we must have learned something from Gaillard's writings in that point. It's a story of the Chevalier d'Aubon. I'll get it right one of these years. But it's an interesting legend about the Chevalier d'Aubon and a princess, the Princess Charlotte, who was daughter of the Duke of Brunswick. The Duke of Brunswick wants to marry his daughter to a Russian prince who is not exactly a prince in terms of his, he's not exactly a good guy. And the legend goes, over my dead body, she tells her dad. And so the story is that she fakes her death. And as the Chevalier is now living out on Bayou St. John, kind of the similar thing as Duplanty. You get these guys that they came in with Bienville. They really don't want to be with, they don't want to people. They want to go off on their own and write and that kind of thing. And you get the idea. But apparently these two had a relationship of some kind back in Europe. So next thing you know, the story is that the princess shows up on a ship at New Orleans asking after the Chevalier, and people are telling her, you got to go back up the bayou, you'll find him up there out in the middle of nowhere in what becomes, or what will later become, the Allard Plantation. He's up there. Basically he's one guy that can I build a little hut here and be a hermit? And the Choctaw were kind of like, hey, yeah, it's okay. At that point, the French and the indigenous were not really at each other's throats, so it kind of worked out nicely. This is where this story just gets lit, is from here. It's crazy. I start looking at this and I'm like, maybe I can find a picture of this guy. Maybe somebody's got a sketch or a portrait. Coming up empty, digging in a whole bunch of places. But then I find an account of the story. But that account says that this all happened in Mobile. And I'm kind of like, oh, please. It's carnival time. Do we have to have another one of these? It's like, but so it's one of these things becomes, you know how legends are. Gaillard is writing it, saying it happened on Bayou St. John. Some guy from Mobile is writing it. Now, did he jack Gaillard's work? Did Gaillard take this and embellish it and say this is it's like, I promised my editor 300 pages on 290, let's add it. I got nothing, but it was just a crazy story. It was a neat story just as a mystery or a romance thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, this happened in Mobile. And I'm just like, oh, go away, people, Okay, so one of the problems digging into some of this stuff, of course, is, well, really two problems. One is that the French weren't very good at maps. Well, I said, that's not fair. The French were good at maps. The French that were here were not good at maps, okay? most of the good maps of New Orleans start appearing or start going into print and publication during the Spanish colonial period. But we do have a few. There are some maps that are basically are pretty good and pretty accurate. This particular map is New Orleans in 1747. And if you're a real nerd, you get the high-res version of this from the Library of Congress, and now you're zooming in on, where your aunt's house was on Conti Street or something, But the important part of this one is not so much any of that as it is, and I can't, if you look at the map itself, you'll see obviously the Place d'Armes, so that's the church just above it. If you go up to the top, now remember this is 1747, there's no Rampart Street, there's nothing outside, the cemetery's not even there yet. But if you look, there's a little snaking road there just to the right a little bit. That is Bayou Road. And Bayou Road has been there literally that long. Why was Bayou Road there? That's the Great Portage. That's how the pirogues came down into that marshy, swampy combination of the end of Bayou Metairie and the end of Bayou St. John. Kind of sort of where Parkway is now. It's like the best, that's the best reference point for it at this point. And then just the portage, the indigenous would just hack through a trail and everything else. The French turned it into a road. Why? Because they were Gauls. Where did they learn road building from? The Romans, right? They learned from pretty smart guys in that sense, right? Eventually, of course, Bayou Road is, I don't want to say supplanted or superseded by the Carondelet Canal. Both of them were in use at that point and going from there. Here's a 1798 map so again, now we've hit Spanish colonial, and so we start seeing, well, for lack of a better way to describe it, we start seeing better maps or more precise maps. This map I like this map because it brings the convergence or sort of convergence of all three bayous into one illustration. So in the top left, I'm turning around again to make sure I don't get that wrong. Top left is Bayou Metairie, and of course they refer to that as the Metairie Road, but that's City Park Avenue. It's like, well, it's why the I-10 exit has both of them on there, right? Because it's kind of, the Metairie Road ran all the way here to Bayou St. John. Then you see, so basically where that bridge is, you see where it says Bayou St. John, you go to the left and there's a convergence of the waterways in that bridge there. That is the turn, the big turn in Bayou St. John. So it's like, how Moss Street curves around, you get where North Carrollton Avenue, Wisner, and City Park Avenue all come together. That's right there. So then you get that big turn in the bayou, and then that's where you get Cabrini High School, where you get Holy Rosary Church, Cabrini High School, keep going until it turns into slushy, marshy Parkway Bakery right down that way, where it finally ends. You can see that that's actually, in this map, that's actually going across at that point. You don't really see the big turn at that point. Over here, out of frame almost on the left, is the Carondelet Canal. And so it's a little bit further out here. The point to this zoom in is to show what becomes the Allard Plantation. Well, actually, if this is 1798, that already was the Allard Plantation right there to the north. So let's talk about the plantation. The original land grant was from the Spanish crown, or from the Viceroy of New Spain, to Francisco Hery, not Henri, but Hery, a.k.a., this note just, I love this kind of stuff. His name is Hery, which kind of French, kind of Spanish, maybe Basque, I don't know, but he's getting a Spanish land grant. But they also know him as Duplanty or Duplanty. Duplantis, Duplanche, Duplanty. One of the things that I love about the Spanish colonial period is the extent to which the Spanish governing guys, soldiers, officers, literally went native when they got here. What happens, of course? Bernardo de Galvez, his wife Felicity, daughter of a French planter. Esteban Miro succeeds, takes over the governorship when Galvez is promoted. He marries an Irish woman whose daughter on a plantation down right by the Delaron plantation. You get the idea. These guys, they were Spanish. They were loyal to the Spanish crown, but they were very much went native in terms of marrying local girls, blending in, working themselves into the New Orleans culture, everything else. So it's like, so here's this guy, right? He gets a land grant up here, up on Bayou St. John, and he adopts, what appears to be happening is he adopts a French name. Why not? You got to talk, you got to do business with these people. So then what happens is Francisco Hery passes away, and Don Santiago Lorreins purchases the Hery estate. And this is where the plaque and this is where it gets kind of confusing. The plaque says that Don Santiago is Louis Allard's grandfather. Everything else says it's his father-in-law. So maybe there were two of them. I don't have any documentation on it, or maybe the plaque just got it wrong, guys. But it's very typical that the Don Santiago doesn't have a son, so naturally he picks up and runs with this. That's how Beauregard got a plantation. It's how the Touses got Central Grocery from the Lupos, right? It's everything like this, right? You get a daughter. The daughter wants to keep the family business going. You married me, you married the family, right? That kind of thing. So Louis Allard inherits the plantation and keeps it going. This map drives me crazy. This map absolutely drives me crazy. Yeah, that's the next slide. Yeah, Derby's already saying, turn it upside down. I don't know what possessed the illustrator, the surveyor who did this map, but the right side of the map is west. And you'll see right here on the map, it says, Allard Angiano, which got nothing on that. But Monsieur Allard, Louis, but we know that he was on the western side, which means all of that other land is wrong. Turn it upside, literally, turn the map upside down. And there's the Grand Bayou de Saint-Jean in the middle. Coming down, there's that bridge that we saw in the other map. Starts to make the big turn right there on Moss with Cabrini. Ever tried to park your car there on Jazz Fest? Good luck with that. But you get the idea. So Lorreins, Don Santiago had holdings on both sides. I have not looked into what that eastern side holding was because primarily I was focused on the Allard Plantation. Turn it upside down, it all works. Here's a map that you don't have to turn upside down. This one's 1828, so it's about 9 years later. Of course, we've gone full American at this point since 1803, but pretty much everything. Anybody ever have to do a title search at the notarial archives? Yeah, you two don't count. But anyway, yeah, it's like, there are no greater level of incredibly smart people with looks of despondency on their faces because they go from trying to, it's like you pull the earliest thing and it's going to be in French. And then it changes to Spanish. And then it changes to Spanglish because it's not even real English yet. And so really by about 1830, everything gets down to English at that point. But I go there and I look at plan books, right? Because I'm a historian. I don't look at property, right? I'm looking at pretty pictures, that kind of thing. So I go in there and I'm in a good mood when I go in there. When I come out though, I just want to leave like a couple of bottles of tequila or something, because those folks, man, they got it rough, right? Well, anyway, okay, so here is Bayou St. John coming kind of sort of left to right. You'll see Judge Martin, Nicholas, Bermudez, all of these different holdings on the eastern side of the bayou. And then, of course, everything up top is, at that point, Allard with one L, because probably now that it's been anglicized completely, it's no longer Allard, but it's the Allard Plantation, hun. So you kind of get the idea there. And then the Castilian, which how that got two L's still, go figure, but, kind of coming up. So you can see the extent of the holding going up a pretty good bit, which, we're starting to talk like up around I-610 for the northern part of the holding. What's interesting, too, is as we start approaching, you're coming up the bayou toward the lake, and of course that very dark kind of shaded piece in the top right corner is Lake Pontchartrain. You see a name there that would look interesting to locals, and that's Milne, because Alexander Milne cut a deal with the Spanish crown. He was a Scotsman. He cut a deal to get a land grant that literally ran from past the Industrial Canal back over to West End and pretty much own the whole lakefront at one point. What did they grow here? At first, guys like Duplanty, guys like the Chevalier were out there and they're growing just a little bit of a patch of indigo on their own so they could raise a little bit of a cash crop. Indigo was easy. It grew pretty well here. It made a good blue dye, which of course was incredibly popular back in the day. And it was easy, is the way to say it. Tobacco didn't quite work out. The swamp did not support tobacco growth. It's like basically Virginia going into Kentucky pretty much killed that. And then, of course, Havana and Cuba in general and tobacco growing. So that didn't work. But indigo worked pretty good. Sugarcane was the thing. Sugarcane grew wild up along the bayou. The problem with sugarcane, of course, was initially getting the sugar out of the cane was quite an effort until Deborah will get there on that. Here's an engraving, colored lithograph by Petit after a drawing by Theodore Bray, depiction of the harvesting of sugarcane on a plantation by enslaved people, as opposed to enslaved. I did it literally, so don't blame me. In the foreground, left a so-called pondo, a flat-bottomed vessel with which the cane was transported to the plantation. There's no details on what plantation this illustration is documenting, but this could very well be anything up and down Bayou St. John, because you would harvest the cane into the banks of the bayou, load it up on the boat, and get it someplace where you could granulate it or you could work with it at that point. Granulating sugar, Etienne de Boré, down at what is now Audubon Park, comes up with, don't you love that? That's a great story too. It's like he tries like 5 times to get this right. And his wife says, don't you dare do this one more time. You're costing us a ridiculous, you're not working. You're doing, it's like, I love all due respect to any musicians, but you know that, right? Your wife, your girlfriend. You're going to go try one more time, right? It's like you could go get a job, And that's what Dubourg's wife is basically telling him at that point. But he nailed it. He figured out how to granulate sugar, and this is the big sugar pots up at Whitney Plantation that have been preserved. What Dubourg's process was that he kind of sorted out at that point was the idea of you boiled water. You basically take those big pots and build fires around. Boil water, cut the cane stalk so it fits into the pot, boil that sucker till the cane basically, the stalk breaks down. You let it cool. You don't let it go to room temperature. Don't let it come back to normal, but you let it cool a little bit. And of course, what happens is as it cools, the sugar crystallizes out of the sap, falls to the bottom of the pot. Now you can scoop it out. Sounds easy? Good luck with that. That thing's boiling and there's a fire under it. And the overseer is making sure that doesn't change, right? The average lifespan of an enslaved worker working the sugarcane pots was about 7 years. So we're not talking, you wonder why they all rebelled, why all the enslaved rebelled in Haiti. That's kind of why, is that sort of thing. So, but that's basically the idea. But the catch is that Dubourg figured it out. And so now all of a sudden, all of that land up with Allard, with all of the other holdings on the other side of the bayou, all of a sudden now, man, we can make some money here, It's like we granulate that sugar, we load it up into barrels, convert it to molasses, you do whatever you want with it. Now all of a sudden, it's not cotton, because we don't get to the swamp. Cotton's not going to grow directly here. That's coming from up the river further. But of course, cotton and sugar become the two big things. That's the two deposit crops that come into the port. And we make a ton of money as a result of that. So Dubourg, this is 1796, 1798, is that granulation process begins. That's when a lot of fortunes change here in New Orleans. And all of that is very much happening literally right up the bayou. Next time you go to Celebration in the Oaks, that's what was going on here at the end of the 18th century. Goes one step further with Norbert Rieu. Rieu invents what's called the multiple effect evaporator. Rieu was a Creole of color who was enslaved. He ends up going to France and actually becomes a chemist and an engineer. Comes back, he's got this idea, and so basically the theory is he's still basically doing Dubourg's granulation process, but he's automated it. He's using evaporators so that instead of having to have humans scoop out that boiling water to get to the sugar at the bottom of the pot and then start all over again, which leads to injuries, burns, death, everything else, he's doing it in a series of canisters, pipes, the whole bit, so that he evaporates off the water. And the irony of this is you still see the big sugarcane pots down at the bottom, which is where the sugarcane, where the granulated sugar still ends up at the end. He patents this in 1846. Does he see any money on now? At that point, he's got his freedom. He's a free man of color, but still not making a ton of money. But the patent holds up, and eventually that becomes how we do things, how we run this. Let's go back to the Allard Plantation. So, Louis inherits the plantation. First, his father-in-law buys the plantation from the original landholder. They start developing the property. Indigo, sugar, starts booming in particular at the end of the 18th century with granulation, moving into the 20th century. They're doing pretty good at that point. Good enough to build a decent manor house on the bayou, that whole bit. This is the best picture that we have of the Allard house. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, it wasn't a big, grand cotton or the big, grand cane plantations like up the river, like with Oak Alley or Nottoway, or even Laura for that matter. No slight to Laura, but it's a little smaller than the other two, you know, that kind of thing. But anyway, that's the idea. It's way the heck in the back there. But that's kind of, you know, it's like you should have such problems as to be living under 400, 300-year-old oak trees like this, okay? This one, every time I look at this picture, and the reference, of course, it's Jules Robert Henig's 1898 painting titled Plantation and Oak Tree. And of course, the plantation ain't nothing, it's the oak tree, right? And it appears that, well, obviously, the artist was much more impressed by the 300-year-old oak tree than somebody's house way there the heck in the back. For the life of me, that is the only thing I can find with it. Because it was not sold as property. Had it been sold as property, or had it been sold as a house and not just a big parcel of land, we might have ended up with a plan book. We might have ended up with basically a real estate drawing of the house. But it was one piece of all of this land, acres of land there along the bayou, so there really wasn't anything to it. The descriptions of the house are absolutely wonderful. Here's Gaillard again. On the bank of Bayou or River St. John, on the land known in our days as Allard's Plantation, and on the very site where now stands the large and airy house which we see shown here, yeah, way under the oak tree, but what the heck, there was a small village of friendly Indians. From the bank opposite the village, beginning where at a much later period was to be erected the bridge which spans the bayou, a winding path made by the Indians, Bayou Road, and subsequently enlarged into Bayou, made into a real road by the French and the Spanish, ran through a thick forest and connected the Indian village with the French settlement of New Orleans. Translate all of that kind of from Gaillard's flowery language. The indigenous, the Choctaw and the Chitimacha had been in this area for hundreds of years. They were doing fine. All of a sudden, Bienville shows up with his brother and a bunch of guys, but Bienville can speak the lingua franca. He kind of, makes a good impression. They don't immediately go to war over anything, and they end up going down and making the Great Portage. The McFadden House, Christian Brothers. This is not the Allard Plantation. And you'll have people that will swear on stacks of Bibles that this is the plantation house. Alas, no. It was built in 1909. City Park became City Park back as early, the first authorizations are in 1870. The park itself starts developing into what we know of as City Park in that, God, you say the early aughts. Now you think of 2000, right? But this is 1900. So by 1909, McFadden builds this beast on basically the Allard land. It's a little further in from the bayou, so we know it's not the house just because of, well, first off, because of the location, second off, because of the date. But he builds this big beast, and this is, of course, where Christian Brothers, the middle school is, or the boys' school, I should say now. It's the way to put it, because they got girls over at St. Anthony over on Canal Street. The Three Oaks kind of define the plantation in my vibe is they define the plantation more than they define the park. Because the park is kind of defined by the last little lagoon piece of Bayou Metairie into all of the stuff that was built out in the early 1900s, whereas the Oaks have been there forever. Suicide Oak. It gets the name, kind of gruesome, This is a 1909 postcard because for a period of 12 years, 16 men took their lives by throwing a rope over a branch on Suicide Oak, and that's where it gets its name. Now, I kept doing this when I finally put the PowerPoint together. I kept looking at that tree, and I keep looking at this tree, and there's a little bit of timing difference there because the plantation house would have been 1850 or so. This is a good almost 60 years later. Trees grow, they change a little bit. You get wind blown from storms and everything else. But man, those two look, I don't know. You know, that's all live oak trees anyway. They all look, you know, they all have a lot of similarities to it. So is Suicide Oak, does that mean that if we were looking back from Suicide Oak, that's where the Allard Plantation house was? I'm thinking so, because these trees, well, Suicide Oak and Singing Oak are closer to the bayou. Dueling Oak, of course, is a little further in. This is one, another one, Suicide Oak. Oh gosh.
That had a house in the background.
Yeah, but that's going to be the McFadden house, because this one's from like 1915 or so, right? So it's long gone. What's interesting about all of these postcards is the way that these postcards were sold. Detroit Publishing, Kurt Tyke, all of these companies, they made tons of money basically selling these postcards in every newsstand, bookshop, hotel lobby, all across the country. The way Detroit Publishing operated their business model was to basically, they would solicit photographs from local photographers. So you got somebody, he's got the big 4x5 camera, right? He's, you know, taking pictures with, you start getting into medium format where you could have a roll of film. They go around, they shoot everything they think is significant, that what would sell as a postcard, they get that in their heads. It's all black and white film. So what they would do is shoot a roll of film and send it to Detroit Publishing, who in turn would mail them back a new roll of film, and they would keep going. The publisher would then make a contact print, you know, nothing, don't print the whole roll, but make a contact print, sit there with your little jeweler's loupe and look at them. They'd say, this, and this look like good photographs for postcards. That tree, yeah, that looks really good for a postcard. This one, with all the Spanish moss hanging on it, probably even better. It's like, that's just foreign something, you know, like an alien planet to people that up north, you know, that kind of thing. So what do then? They print the whole photo and send it back down to the city, whether it's here or Cincinnati or Dallas or wherever that photo originates, and you hire an artist to color it in. Works out great. The only time it hasn't worked out in stuff that I've seen was a postcard of the New Canal Lighthouse where somebody painted the roof green instead of the red. And I'm like, where did you get this? Where did you get the idea that that was ever green, but got me. Dueling Oak, a little bit further in off the bayou. If you start, I got to make Derby redo the talk so we can get it all on, you know, get that, because the stories, the guy with the harpoon was the best for me. Dueling with ship harpoons, you know, it's like, yeah, you got to love it, you know, it's just crazy stuff. But Dueling Oak, of course, was one of the locations of affairs of honor. It made a lot of sense because at that point, antebellum, you know, mid 19th century, 1830s, 1840s, you had to go all the way out into the middle of nowhere. So you weren't going to have the law after you. You weren't going to have anybody messing with your affair of honor. You could go out. These trees were so obvious, you know, obvious landmarks that you could say, we're going to meet under this oak tree and we're going to settle it there, that kind of thing. And that's where you get, it's like, ever drive down Wisner Boulevard early in the morning, you know, like just after daylight, and it's like that fog over the golf course. Now, you know, just put a couple of carriages going out there and somebody going to get shot, you know, that kind of thing. But You get the idea. It's just gorgeous at that point. This is an St. Blessing photograph from most of the collection that is in that's at Louisiana State Museum. Most of these are from 1864, but I always label them as 1860s. You'll notice the tomb isn't there yet. Not sure about how that pops in and everything else at that point. Here's a zoom in of where the actual affair of honor would take place. This is a Works Progress Administration, WPA, photograph from the 1930s. There's a lot of good art programs and documentation programs, basically starving artist programs during the Depression, 38, 39, and 40. By 40, you started getting enough of the war effort going that they didn't need to do those anymore. But we get an incredible amount of documentation on the city and a number of different things, just stories written, photograph and photographic documentation, as well as architectural illustrations and paintings and everything as a result of those WPA projects. There's the tomb, but we'll come back to that. This is a dual reenactment put on by one of the history projects sponsored by the WPA in the 30s. Now, I always put 1930s because some of these programs started as early as 36, but usually they're 38 to 40 is kind of the range for this. So you can see, let's go have a reenactment. You know, we've had guys going down to Chalmette to do the battle for generations. Let's go out here onto that big great lawn in front of what at the time would still have been the Delgado Museum, or the Delgado Art Museum. Doesn't become NOMA for quite some time at that point, but you can see two guys with rapiers. The seconds are over on the side, ready to step in if they suspect any kind of treachery or somebody wants to back out. Singing oak. The water in the background, to get your bearings on this photo, the water in the background is Big Lake, which of course Big Lake is there just to the north and up closer to the bayou from the art museum. This is just just a few steps, as you can see, from the edge of Big Lake, again going up a little bit more to this tree. The bayou is out of frame on the other side of the tree trunk. So you're looking toward the river. The bayou is here, moving into the rest of the park on the other side. The stories of Singing Oak are such that the arrangement, just the positioning of the branches as the wind would go through it, would generate some whistling and some vibration. After Katrina, people started hanging wind chimes on the oak tree to enhance the singing of Singing Oak. And there are very few places that are as peaceful just to just plop out there and do nothing for an hour or two. Especially if you're like an exercise person, you've already walked Big Lake twice. Come back over here and just take it all in. Suicide, dueling, and singing. Do they have anything to really do with the plantation? Well, yeah, they give you some solace when you're working your butt off trying to cut sugarcane and everything else. So definitely, you know, the Allard Plantation, there were worse places. I mean, it's all ugly, but there's worse places to be. The tomb. The tomb is a weird mystery because it turns out nobody knows who was in it, if there ever was anybody in it. So the tomb is directly under Dueling Oak. And so naturally, that sparks and inspires legendary stories all the way into honest-to-goodness fiction of, if I die today, bury me under this beautiful oak tree because I have failed in my quest to gain my honor, or, you know, in the duel, whatever. The natural assumption was that the tomb was the last resting place of Louis Allard. But it's not. Because the Allard family has it well documented that Louis and his brother Robert are in St. Louis number 2. So it's kind of like, who's in the tomb? Because the initial thing was, okay, Louis, all right, maybe it wasn't him. Well, then maybe it was his brother. Nope. He's in the family tomb with his brother. So that didn't quite work. So this is going in now into the 1900s. Basically, the park is now under city control, authorized by the state, owned and operated by the city in New Orleans. The board for City Park is not really looking to get the story right. Because going out and checking out the tomb, or going there and investigating, people writing stories, the mystery was more valuable than the reality. So they left it as, is Allard in there? Who knows, right? That kind of thing. This goes on all the way the heck to 2011. When at that point, the Park Commission pretty much, now this is after Katrina, the area, well, the big problem here, it wasn't so much that the area sustained wind damage, of course, but the tomb flooded. And so it shifted a little bit. It was a little bit unstable, that kind of thing. So they're kind of like, maybe it's time. Maybe we just, take the thing down and that kind of thing. So basically the Park Commission comes clean. Yeah, no, there wasn't anybody here. We don't know who the heck was in it. There's nothing in it. We got no idea. So it was cleared out in 2011. I'd have left it. Of course, they were worried. That's all liability and everything. Somebody's going to try to pull the top off and see if there's anything in it and that kind of thing. But I put me on team mystery, right? It's like it makes better stories and that kind of thing. So now we're coming in. Basically, we've hit the, we're starting to hit the end of the Allard ownership of the plantation. And basically what happens is in 1845, so mind you, this is antebellum. 1845, New Orleans is booming. New Orleans is a big deal. We're talking, you got the Natchez up on the river right now. So you got one steamboat, one riverboat that parallel parks at a dock right there. In 1845, you had over 100 riverboats angle parking. You ever see a riverboat? You know how it's got the big gangplank at the front? There's a reason it's got a gangplank. That's all the parking space he got. He couldn't come in just angle park, parallel park on the side. That kind of. This city is booming. Ryu is coming in with well, first off, granulation is making the city a ton of money in terms of sugarcane. The cotton is coming in. They didn't call it King Cotton for nothing, and it wasn't the hot dog, that's for sure. But you get the idea there. It's like, and this guy's losing his plantation. And not only does he lose his plantation, but he loses it for failure to pay taxes. So the city comes in, they seize the plantation. Now he's an older guy at this point. It's like this is 1845, and you see McDonough buys it. He allows Louis to live on the plantation until he passes 2 years later. So family disorganization, somebody doesn't have their act together with the books. Was there a relative that was gambling things away and the profits were vanishing? Not quite sure, but it boiled down to the city closing down the plantation, basically seizing the property and putting it up for auction at a sheriff's sale. Enter John McDonough. John McDonough, of course, we know the name because of the extent of his philanthropy. He was from Baltimore. He was a Marylander who was bouncing back and forth basically on ships back and forth basically he was a merchant between New Orleans and Baltimore. It's one of the reasons, it's not McDonough's the reason, but it's like people always say, hey, y'all don't talk like you're from the South. It says, nah, we talk like we're from Baltimore or Philly or something like that. And there's a reason for that, all that trade back and forth. Anyway, McDonough was part of all of that, and he makes a ton of money, and his way of handling the philanthropy was he just basically gave his fortune to the city. He splits up a ton of the money into two parcels, one to build public schools in Baltimore, the other to build McDonough this, that, and the other down here as a result. In addition to that, though, he's a merchant, he's a businessman. He buys the Allard Plantation in 1845. It's good sugarcane property, et cetera, et cetera. He could pick it up for a song at a sheriff's auction. He sees that the previous owner is still with us for another couple of years. He lets him live in the house. McDonough does not really live to enjoy this, of course, because he himself passes in 1850. He wills the land, he wills the Allard Plantation to the city as part of his big grant and his philanthropic grant to the city. Then it becomes a long and involved process. It involves the city of New Orleans government. Of course it's a long and involved process. The city gets the property in 1850, settling the secession and everything else. Stretch that into 1860. Let's call it a 5-year speed bump on development from there. So pretty much nothing really happens with this until 1870. The Louisiana legislature authorizes the creation of New Orleans Park in 1870, and that's the first incarnation of the Park Commission and that process. What was willed over from the McDonough estate to the city was about 300 acres. But the Allard Plantation was much larger than that. So the city basically had to buy back some of that. The city of New Orleans is buying something that they probably already owned. That never happens, does it, right? 1870, and that's happening, right? So eventually, though, by putting it all together and expanding out into that Castilian area and everything else, the park hits 1,300 acres in total by 1927. So one of the interesting things about City Park, though, is a lot of folks assume that the big things in City Park along Bayou Metairie, along the lagoon, are WPA projects, because naturally there was a ton of stuff. But that's not the case. Most of the development in the park starts in the in the 1900s. The Peristyle is one of the first things. Then the pop bandstand and the fountain, the casino building. All of these predate the Depression area development projects. This is stuff that was built by the city because this is gorgeous land, and the people uptown didn't want the riffraff. They'd rather have them out on Bayou Metairie, right? That kind of thing. So you make it all nice and pretty, and we all come out here. So I kind of end on the Peristyle because it is the one big, I personally think the bandstand's cooler, but, because the acoustics of the bandstand are wonderful if you ever hear, actually hear music played under it. But as you see, the Peristyle is just, it's beautiful. It's anything from a place to sit and stretch out by those two big lions on the lagoon side, just hang out for a while. It's a venue for anything from a banquet. It was in NCIS New Orleans. They staged a bombing at the Peristyle. You got to love it, right? Hey, it worked. It worked as a cinematic or television type thing. A lot of the stuff I referenced comes from Ms. Catherine Campanella's book on New Orleans City Park. It is part of the Images of America series. which is near and dear to my heart, as I'll explain in the next slide, from Arcadia Publishing. And both Derby and I have published books with Arcadia. Ms. Campanella has, I think, like 5 or 6 books as well. And between this and her Lake Pontchartrain book, they are, if you're into this stuff, they're must-haves. Speaking of must-have books, a word from your sponsor. These are my 6 books. The first book I did was the one top in the middle that says New Orleans Canal Streetcar Line. Did it in 2004 when the red streetcars came back. You know, everything was ripped up in '64, and in true New Orleans tradition, 40 years later, we put it all back. Which you gotta love, with some very lovely streetcars. It's great history. I have a friend who has been who was a friend and a mentor going all the way back to high school, and he's a professor of urban planning and everything. And he tells me, he says, "Ed, you know what I really like about your book is it doesn't have any words." I'm like, "Gee, thanks, dude." But he was serious because he tells, it's images of America. They got pictures, captions, that kind of, not long, detailed, everything else. And when you got grad students that are reading everything under the sun, this thing gives you 128 pages of how things developed on Canal Street. The other books, Brothers of the Sacred Heart in New Orleans. Bet you can't guess where I went to high school. But you kind of get the idea. It starts with Aloysius going into Coriezu and, of course, ends or continues the story with Brother Martin. Book on top, the other book on the other side of the canal book, Maison Blanche Department Store. Mr. Bingle is chapter 3. And, of course, it tells a really fun story of a really fun place that I worked out at Clearview. New Orleans Jazz. I was originally, I pitched that book as Faubourg Treme, and it was going in, you remember the show on HBO, David Simon's show Treme, right? And it was 3 seasons in, and he was going to do that 1/2 a season to tie up all the loose ends. So I pitched the acquisitions editor. They emailed me back, said, "Can you get a call with us? We think we want to expand the scope of your pitch." I said, "Okay, what do you have in mind?" And he says, "How about New Orleans Jazz?" I said, "Do you know what it's like being judged by PhDs in jazz when you're not?" Anyway, it worked out though. It was fun to do. Legendary Locals of New Orleans was fun. It's like a who's who of all kind of people. I always tell librarians, if you're a school librarian, you need 3 or 4 copies of my book. Not because I get money on it. I get $4, right? But no, you want the book in the library because you get that 5th grader who comes in and says, "My teacher tells me I got to do a social studies project on somebody who lived in New Orleans." So you grab my book, you throw it at them. There's 200 people in there. Find somebody you like, and now you can go dig a little further, right? That kind of thing. And then it's interesting. There's also Ms. Campanella, who wrote the City Park book, did Legendary Locals of Metairie. There's one person that overlaps both books. Any guesses? No. Close. Well, not close, but Ellen DeGeneres. I put her in because her burgeoning career between her brother Vance and working in clubs in the Quarter, and as an entertainer, she's New Orleans. She went to Riverdale. And she she actually went to Grace King and Riverdale. Take that back. And she worked at the mall. I don't know if you've ever seen Ellen's old JCPenney commercial. She worked at the JCPenney at Lakeside. So Campanella put her in because of growing up. I put her in because of the French Quarter. It's the one overlap in there at that point. And then, of course, the Krause book, which after I'd done the MB book, the History Press had come and said, "Would you be interested in doing another department store book?" I said, "Would I be interested in doing the book that's made me the most money again?" Yeah, twist my arm. No. Oh, that was so much fun, though, because all of this is, it's like I'm a good little Catholic boy, but the stuff I learned about Jewish retailing and the various connections between Jewish families in New Orleans was worth the price of admission, let me tell you. That's my 6 books. They're available from all the usual suspects. In particular, I suggest go see Tom Lowenberg up at Octavia Books if you want to support local. If not, Barnes & Noble works for me too. You ever want them signed or anything, just hit me up. I will definitely do it. Now that I am retired, I spent a lot of time at the actual 1799 Cabildo, doing volunteer work with the Friends of the Cabildo. I do museum tours of the Cabildo, as well as I am one of the volunteer tour guides for the Friends of the Cabildo's French Quarter walking tour. I usually do about 2 a month. Next month I'll be doing one on the 5th and one on St. Patrick's Day. If you have a group that ever wants to do it, it's $30 a head. You want to do it, we can arrange. I'll come, lead the tour. If you want to come have a Cabildo tour, that's the price of admission. It's $11. Come on, I'll take you around anytime. And we can coordinate that. Shout out to the people who made this PowerPoint template. It's in the Creative Commons. You ever like this with the parchment-y and the ink stains and everything? Just ping me. I'll be happy to send it to you. Ping me. Funny you should ask that. Where do you ping me? NOLAHistoryGuy.com, at NOLAHistoryGuy on all social media. How are we doing? Any questions? Anybody got any thoughts, comments? Yes?
You were talking about the dueling oak. I was always told there were 2 dueling oaks, and one of them was felled in 1949 in a hurricane, but they used to meet between the 2 oak trees, the duelers.
I've heard that, and I don't have a photo of 2 of them. Because like the blessing photo just shows the one, and that goes back to 1860. So, I mean, it's a grove of live oak trees. I'll buy it. Oh, yes, sir.
Has anybody done any archaeological digging for the foundations of the old Allard Plantation out in the park?
To my knowledge, no. Now, there's a couple of things with that. You ever been to Pito House or like to Laura? They're built up on pilings.
I was on the board of trustees.
Oh, well, there you go, right? I mean, but that's what I'm saying. It's like I don't want to say there's no ground, but that's part of the problem is that these houses were, out there, it was swamp, right? So a lot of it's on pilings. It's not like Nottoway or, it's not like when you get further up and you're on bedrock. So, and that's the extent of it. Forget it. I was in a different building at UNO than archaeology, so I don't know a whole lot beyond that. So, yeah.
What happened to the house? Did it burn, or did it just...
I think they just tore it down because there is no reference to what happens to it. And the fact that McDonough buys the so McDonough buys the property in 45. Allard passes away in 40. He says, you can live in the house. McDonough has no interest in living out on the bayou, right? He basically was more a Marylander anyway, even though his business interests took him here. I think they just tore it down after, there was no interest at that point. McDonough dies basically literally right after buying it. And then now it's the city, right? So you get a combination of it being owned by the city, then coming into the war. You had several Union battalions that had bivouacked along the bayou, so you can almost see them pulling that down for wood, for heat, for everything else. Anybody? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
The tomb that was taken down in 2011.
Yeah.
Did they do anything with it? Did they try to, you said there was no body, but when was it built? There was nothing?
Yeah, there was,
was it a newer construction?
The park, at the time, because it was down, it got flooded big time and shifted off of the original foundation of the tomb during Katrina. And so by 11, the commission just treated it as a nuisance and a liability.
So they didn't even try to
No, they just jackhammered it and took it down. Yeah. Sorry, there was another. Yes, ma'am.
City Park is a wonderful gift to the city of New Orleans, but it comes, I understand, with covenants. Like they couldn't sell it to land for houses and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about it if you know?
Yeah, it's funny, it's crazy how these things come out in terms of as background information. But a lot of this came out with the monuments removal because of the Beauregard statue. And that was the thing, was that you had a lot of people outside of New Orleans that were just absolutely outraged that Mitch was taking down the Beauregard statue. And it turns out, of course, that yes, the whole thing is locked down like nobody's business, and it's all owned by the city. There was absolutely nothing, it's like there was nothing anybody in Baton Rouge could, they authorized it themselves in 1870 to make the whole thing go. And yeah, that's one of the things that you see with that is it's the idea of using it for housing or residential, that's long past, but what you get is things like when they built the new Children's Museum. And then all of a sudden, you get I don't want to say that in a derogatory way, but you've got people who firmly believe that the park land grant, or the park acquisition, was for green space. And that building another building, it's a zero-sum game, right? And you're taking away green, you don't get new green space someplace else if you put that building there. So yeah, it's a hornet's nest. And every time they want to do something, we got to dig that master plan thing that they did. I've got that somewhere. I'll have to put that on the website because it gives some background on what they want to do and what they can and can't do as a result. Any other?
So are all three of those trees still standing?
Yes, they are. They sure are. Yeah. Yeah, that's oak trees. They were old when this story started, right? So yeah, very much so. Yes, sir.
I'll just interject a little bit on the question about the archaeology. My company did an archaeological survey of most of City Park right after Katrina. There were a few spots we couldn't do, but we did most of it. Didn't find squat.
Why am I not surprised? I would just and again, this is Ed the amateur here. But when you think, because I've done a lot of work with transit and everything, and so when you get into high ground, like when you get on the Metairie Ridge, and that's when they ran into all kind of problems building the cemeteries terminal, because you start hitting literally indigenous mounds, and burial area right there at Canal and City Park. You're not finding any of that out in that swamp. It's transient. I'm not surprised, but I'm glad to hear they did it. But
The most interesting thing we found is in one area there's a lot of mini balls, which I think it may have been Union troops practicing.
that was the 54th, or no, 54th was the Glory Unit. 42nd Massachusetts was bivouacked up there. That later becomes Camp Beauregard, and basically, that I could see you finding bivouac, stuff and everything up in there because of that. Anything? Guys, I'm sorry. Yeah, one more.
Can you tell us a little bit about the casino building?
The casino building, 1920s. It's the Spanish name for casino, not a house of gambling, right? So that kind of thing. It was, for a long time, a combination of the park offices. My wife had to do the audit. They no air conditioning on the second floor too. The big fan, box fans and everything, right? Yeah. But yeah, it was basically a big pavilion that you could have as a combination of upstairs office space, downstairs retail, traditional European that kind of thing. Of course, somebody got the idea way too. You would think they would have come up with the idea of bringing morning call over there a lot earlier, but that kind of thing.
I just remember playing there as a kid.
Yeah, go feed the ducks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could buy your popcorn.
And it got revived, and you could go inside. So I was wondering. So it never was a gambling.
Oh gosh, no. That's casino in the Spanish terms of a big pavilion type building.
Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. Next month,